I've seen one example here of how we could use demand side for providing a reserve service. And here, the action was directly to the device through frequency. This is possible because we use frequency. Here's another example that is implemented in an experimental grid that is deployed on our campus. You recognize Mario Paoloni's building there, equipped with solar panels. So at floor 0 of this building, there is an experimental microgrid that is providing what is called a dispatchable feeder. The idea of a dispatchable feeder is that the grid, or the owners of the operators of a local grid, agree with a Swiss grid, for example, about a power profile. This is the green line that is given here. Of course, this green line is highly compressed in time. A power profile of 0 means here you say my grid is energy neutral, truly energy neutral. Very oftentimes when you hear that somebody has a building that's energy neutral, it just means that over the year, the amount of kilowatt hour that they consume is equal to the amount of kilowatt hour that they produce. But it's not really neutral in the sense if you produce and consume at different times, you still need a grid. Here, the idea is to control at a very quasi-instantaneous time scale the power exchange. Why is that an interesting idea? Well, in order to combat the large variability that will occur in the future due to renewable and more renewable energy production and also more variable consumption, one idea is to make the local grids manage their variability. So it's a balance between an energy neutral building that would be completely isolated from the grid and one that is completely dependent on the grid. Here we say there is a contract between a distribution grid and the main grid and Swiss grid, for example. This contract will allow two things. It will allow first to go to the energy market. So if you are Romande Energie running this grid here, you could say for this grid, I can now buy exactly here, I buy 0 power, and here I have negative power. That means I am buying power from the grid, and before that I was exporting power. So you can go to the energy market directly from the distribution side. And the second thing is that once you have produced this, you can participate very easily in the regulation markets, which means you can provide regulation services to the grid. So that is an essential way to make the grid essentially more stable, because every local owner participates in the global stability. If we don't do that, if you think about it, we think that perhaps in 25 years from now, Switzerland will have lost all its nuclear generators and replaced them by solar panels, essentially. Not exclusively, but to a large amount by solar panels. So we have replaced 4 sites with 6 generators, or order of 6 generators, big generators, by millions of solar panels. So you don't control millions of devices in the same way as you were controlling 5 or 6 big devices. So one way to do that is to say every feeder is now also part of the generation. The nuclear plants is replaced by distribution networks that produce the energy. So if they produce the energy, they should also participate into the stability of the system. In particular, it will be cheaper and more robust if they provide primary and secondary reserves. It's very easy to provide this reserve if you have produced a dispatch plan. If we know, for example, during this period of time, the expected power is 0, then we can define a regulation as a difference between 0 and what we produce. Similar here, we had agreed to buy some energy. Any deviation from what we buy can be viewed by the TSO, by the entity that runs the global grid, as a regulation service. And this is exactly what this grid is providing, using controllers and agent-based software that I already mentioned when we spoke of microgrid. So here you see, for example, the frequency monitored at, for example, the slack bus of this grid. We see here at this period of time, the frequency is higher than 50 Hertz. If the frequency is higher, that means that all generators should that do primary frequency control should produce less. There is overproduction. Power is in excess, which is exactly what is done here. This grid at this point in time was expected to do the green line, and we see it's doing the blue line, which is a bit less here. So it is consuming more than what it had advertised, because the grid is equipped with a regulator that monitors the frequency and instructs the flexible resources of the grid. Here there is a battery in this grid, but there might be also in some cases solar panels. This will be that you can curtail. So this is believed to be one of the mechanisms through which we could have a replacement of bulk generations through solar panels. The problem with solar panels, they may overproduce, so we may need to curtail them, and the curtailment could be done here in a very fine grain using agents and software and PMUs, as I'm showing here the result. While doing that, of course, you may need to control the grid here. The grid here is a prototype of a grid that has a few weak links. So to be fully representative of what would happen in the future. So there is one line in particular that has a current maximum capacity here of 30 amps, and that needs to be also tightly controlled to make sure that the power flow does not exceed the capacity of the line. So here we find in this example here all the combinations of all the problems that will arise in the future. Regulation that needs to be now distributed everywhere, and grid congestion problems. So that's an example of demand response that is not taking place at the appliance level, but at the level of a microgrid. So this type of microgrid is not widely deployed. We expect them to be more deployed in the coming years, but this is really part of the smart grid revolution. Things that are deployed are more primitive things, like I will mention two. One of them is Voltalis, which is really one of the precursors of demand response. But before I go to this, there is a question about what is PCC. In this line here, there is PCC. PCC is one of the jargon of electrical grids, which means point of common coupling. This is where this grid is connected to the main grid. So that's the PCC power. That's the power exchange between the main grid and this microgrid here. It's the slack bus for this grid. So back to demand response. This is an example of demand response that's addressing exclusively the energy mismatch problem. It's not at all addressing the problems that may occur due to congestion in the grid. This is targeting electrical boilers and electrical heaters, resistive heaters, not heat pumps. So this company, Voltalis, if you agree to sign a contract with them, they will bring into your house a small box, they call the Blue Pod, that will receive a radio signal from Voltalis to switch off your heating for up to 1 hour max here. So we see that the time scale is up to 1 hour max. So it's more than the fridges that we said before, where fridges were really providing primary reserve. Here it's more secondary reserve that it's providing. How does it work from the Voltalis viewpoint? Well, first, they say we do not pay nor charge to you anything. So if you agree to have Voltalis install something in your house, the installation will not cost you anything, but they will also not give you any money. So you could say, why do people agree to have that? Well, the acceptance is based on the good citizenship, because Voltalis made a good campaign to say, we have an energy problem, in particular in some parts of the country. This is more perceived in the parts of the country that don't have a lot of nuclear generators. So the perception of the energy problem is used to say, well, if we want to avoid making peak generators, why don't you participate in this program here? Also, interestingly, they claim that this causes an energy reduction, which means you will see it on your electricity bill, you will pay less. So we don't pay to you, but we help you save here. So similar things are done in other countries, Canada, US, UK, here with the direct payments to users, direct or indirect. Voltalis makes no payment at all. In those countries, there is, for example, a reduction on your electricity bill if you participate in this program. So it is similar to what we have seen exists already in Switzerland, where in Switzerland it's part of the contract already. You know your boiler may be interrupted, and for that you already get a discount. You pay the electricity of your boiler much less than the electricity of the rest of the house. So that's one way to do it. Here they use a different way, but the effect is very similar. More recently, a similar idea has been deployed in Switzerland. It's the company called TICO. That's the website of TICO. They do the same, but they address also heat pumps. So Voltalis targets really resistive heatings. TICO addresses also heat pumps, which is more interesting because there are many, many heat pumps that are deployed and being deployed. So that's the technology of the future. This is a map of all the deployments of TICO in Switzerland. And interestingly, if you go to TICO's site, they say, in fact, here's a paper that describes the technical approach. What they do and what Voltalis also does is sold by some as a virtual power plant. So a virtual power plant is a buzzword that has been used to call a collection of electrical resources that is manipulated by software, by control from the cloud here. So this is exactly what we do when we instruct a heat pump to stop. So this is, for example, what is shown. This is the cycle that a heat pump in dark blue would have. But we see here that it's interrupted here by 52 minutes by signals received from TICO here. So in some sense, it's a virtual power plant because if we aggregate all this at a time scale, at the scale of a country, it is similar to having started a generator. At least this is what is claimed by the proponents of TICO. We will see there are perhaps some differences here. How does TICO and Voltalis make a living out of this? Well, we see that Voltalis doesn't pay anything to the customers. The same holds for TICO. If you accept to have TICO install your system on your heat pump, you will not receive any money. You will receive a service. TICO gives a monitoring service for your heat pump and your heating system. So you have for free a computer interface that you can activate from your smartphone to see how everything is working in your house. So in some sense, that's an indirect payment. But they still must receive revenue. And the answer is, well, they provide reserve service. In the case of TICO, they participate in what is called Swissgrid secondary reserve services. So they provide regulation services, the one we mentioned before the break, to Swissgrid here. So whenever Swissgrid says, oh, I need 100 megawatts more power now, then TICO will send signals to all those heat pumps to reduce their consumption, and this will have the effect of reducing the consumption by 100 megawatts. Similarly, for increasing, if Swisscom says, oh, I need to consume more then TICO will send a signal instructing the heat pumps to start their cycle a bit earlier. So this is deployed. There's another research that's been done by and which is described in this paper here, which goes even further and has the idea of using those thermal loads as long-term reserves. And the idea here is to play with boilers. So boilers have, in countries like Switzerland, a technology that is based on highly insulated storage, because this was optimized to grid services where the price is much lower at predefined times of the day, typically of the night. So in many houses, the boiler is heated during the night, and then you can take a number of showers during the day. If you exceed that number of showers, you don't have hot water. So you have a storage that can live for hours, in fact, for an entire day. This is how it's been dimensioned. So the idea is that, well, a day is a lot of time, so that could be used as a tertiary reserve here. So assume now TICO or a similar company would control not the heat pumps, but also boilers. how can we provide secondary reserve? Well, the idea is to use what is called aggregate energy curves. So here on this part, we see the typical power profile of a boiler. We see that it's heating, it's consuming power, so it's heating at some point in time, and then it's not doing anything. If I integrate this over time, I obtain the energy curve, which is the red curve here, which is simply the integral of power. It means all the energy that has been absorbed by this boiler. For those of you who took the advanced networking part of this class, this is similar to the cumulative arrival functions we saw, which are a convenient way to study deterministic services. So here it's the same idea. It's a convenient way to study the amount of buffer that we have. So this is giving the curve that my boiler has here. Now, if we aggregate this and then the idea is that this is what a boiler does if you follow exactly this schedule. But you have some flexibility in the schedule. The idea is that here the boiler is consuming from 3 in the middle of the night to 4:30, but we could have boiled the water early, perhaps starting at midnight, or a bit later, because the consumption is expected to take place later. If we do that, we find two curves, which are envelopes for these energy curves, which are this curve here that says this is the earliest time, this is the curve we obtain if we store the energy as early as possible. And here, this is what we have if we store the energy as late as possible. So here, and this gives us an envelope. So for a single boiler, it's not very exciting. But the point is you could do that easily, in fact, because at the timescale of one boiler, there is some randomness. How many showers will be taken? What's the consumption of one household? But at the scale of a country, the law of large numbers make it easier to predict. So we can forecast what are those two envelopes, which are the upper bound and the lower bound that are given here. So this is essentially saying, if I have the full control of those boilers, the total amount of energy that I store into the boiler, aggregated from time zero, for example, from midnight, should be somewhere between those two lines here. If I am above the line, then I cannot be above the line because there's not enough place in the boiler to store. If I'm below the line, I have a problem. I might not be providing the service that people would expect. The boiler would not be at maximum temperature in the morning when people use it. So we need to be between the two. And then the idea is I will choose a trajectory that's in the middle of this, so that if there is a reserve event, if Swissgrid calls me to say, oh, I need a number of megawatts for a long period of time, then I will deviate from this trajectory while remaining between the bounds here. So for example, if at time T1 minus 15, the grid calls for a reserve, remember the tertiary reserve are typically cold standby generators. So if we apply it to demand response, that means we'll leave you some time. That means I will continue on this curve for the 15 minutes, which is when I need to start. And then I start my generation, which is not really any generation, but that means I will take a curve here, a trajectory, that will be as low as possible, the slope as small as possible, here at 0, such that I remain between the bounds, which means that during this time here, in this instance it's 4 hours, I can during 4 hours stop all my boilers, and if I do that, I know that I will be between the bounds, because then I can restart at the full power and still end up being below, above the lower curve that is given. Of course, the same could occur in the reverse direction. If for some reason we need to absorb more energy, then we might do a similar trajectory going up here. And if we can forecast those two bounds, we can also quantify the amount of reserve. So this is what is proposed here as a service. It's not yet implemented, but there's a concrete proposal to do it. So those are the kind of services that people like you might be busy inventing startups or other mechanisms to deploy them in the future. So this is how demand response can provide tertiary reserve. So we see that demand response can be a tool to provide all kind of reserves that the grid needs for its operation. Here's another example that has received a lot of attention that's described in this paper because it's been implemented for real in an island, the island of Bornholm, which belongs to Denmark. And because it's an island, it's connected to the mainland, but through a cable that occurs to be frequently cut because it's in the sea, but the Baltic Sea here is very shallow and it's very frequent that ships actually cut the cable. So there are frequent cuts. When there is a cut, the island is truly an electric island as well. We say it's islanded. So of course, the electric island is, from an electric viewpoint, much more difficult to stabilize. This is where demand response can be used here. On the island, there is wind production, and as we know, wind production is very, very variable. There is also a heating system with a coal plant, but the coal plant has some limits, and also you don't want to burn too much coal, even though you're close to Poland and to coal burning in Germany that are very coal friendly, but still you want to reduce that as much as possible. And there's also a ramping issue that when there is a cable cut, you need very quickly to have megawatts of additional power that the coal plant is not able to produce. So what they have deployed is essentially demand response in homes. Lots of homes that are vacation homes, so similar to the Swiss Alp landscape. They can easily be controlled by the same kind of systems that we have seen with Voltalis type of things. We send a signal to all the heaters to stop heating, and that will provide the kind of response that is needed. Interestingly, in this case, they found that there's also a need for positive demand response. So demand response is about reducing the power, so stopping the heating. But in fact, due to the variability of the wind here, sometimes there is the opposite. The wind is complemented with a fairly static coal plant. So there are periods of time where there is excess of production. So what do you do when there's excess of production? You could disconnect some of the windmills, but that is spilling energy. So one way to avoid this is to also instruct the heaters, the hot waters and the refrigerators, all thermal loads to anticipate their heating actions. So both here have been deployed and are described in this experiment here. So this is here truly providing a small-scale regulation service where, in fact, all the timescales of primary, secondary, and tertiary are collapsed here because the grid is very small. Here is another example that is addressing what I mentioned before. So this paper is addressing grid congestion due to electric cars. That was a visionary paper of 10 years ago, and this is perhaps going to be true only in the coming years, where electric cars will truly be largely deployed here. So this simulation has been done on the Belgian grid, and they found that with 30% penetration level of electric cars in some neighborhoods, you had a number of areas where you had problems here. So here the power loss is excessive because the grid is weak. So one way that a grid weak manifests itself is in voltage problem. The voltage might drop, which is seen on this curve here. But also the current on the line may become excessive, which will first translate into power losses. So loss of power when you start losing 5 or 6% of the power, well, you're losing 5 or 6% of the money. But also that may cause heating of insulators, of transformers, that eventually might cause a disconnect. So the e-car charges, so at the time of this paper, it's interesting that what they called high power was 4 kilowatt. Now what we call high power with a car is 20 kilowatts or more. So this paper here was in fact highly optimistic. Things will get much worse when we have higher power chargers here. What's the solution to that? Well, the solution is to accept the flexibility of the car, and they propose here a solution that will look very familiar to us. Well, they propose to have a schedule through which we send explicit signals to the e-car chargers that participate into controlling the grid, and that will instruct about the max power, the power that the e-car can receive here. This was a fairly simple mechanism that does not address all the problems that since then we know are to be considered. For example, we don't want to change too frequently the power that's allocated to a car, because that has some direct effect on the battery aging. So those are other issues that are found in other papers. But here we see that the very simple solution, if we ignore this battery aging problem, is simply to say, well, if I want to avoid the power losses here, I will minimize the power losses on the line, which is directly given by this, which will translate into, in a simple grid model, into a power flow on the line. And then the problem is how to allocate power to every user here. So that, with some more details that I will skip here, translates into an OPF. How do I allocate the power to every car such that the grid constraints are satisfied here? Voilà, we've done a landscape of all the, a very, very small landscape of what all the demand response projects or products exist today. Expect to find more in the future, so that's a domain together in general with the concept of controlling the grid that is in full development. So many of you probably will find interesting projects in the future in that area. Now what we will do is we will stop there a bit and try to think about a few things. So first question, let me ask you this one. In this early demand response programs that were launched, one of the points that were advertised is the absence is energy reduction here. But what I said at the beginning of this lecture is, no, it's not true. The goal of demand response is not to reduce the energy. So what is happening? Is somebody cheating here? What do you think? Give me your opinion. As soon as I have posted the quiz. Voilà. I'll close the poll in a few seconds. And the majority says B. Well, in fact, here, quite exceptionally, I will not give the answer. I will leave the answer to what we will see a bit later. So right now, yes, we could think there is no reduction in total energy consumed. At the same time, it's hard to believe that a company that has a large deployment could claim that there is an energy reduction. And if it's wrong, probably this company would have trouble. Some consumer associations would probably file a complaint somewhere. So what is happening? Well, let's do a bit of theory to see where the truth is. Let's start first with the economic theory of demand response. This is the very, very simple theory on which a lot of demand response, in particular demand response by price, is based. It's important to know it, but as we will see, it's also important to know its limitation. So the economic theory of demand response, like many economic theory, is based on the assumption that users are rational and follow some utility maximization. So we assume consumers are exposed to price, they see a price, and as a result of price, they will buy some energy quantity Q. When the price is P, they will buy Q, and in order to know what to buy, we assume here that users are able, implicitly or explicitly, to formulate a utility function. The utility of Q says how much utility there is for you in buying that amount of energy. Now that seems a bit weird, but this is, believe it or not, how many economists think. They think that we as economic agents, we are optimizing the utility of things, which is of course exaggerated. I don't know exactly what is the utility of going on vacation for 1 week on a Greek island. It has a price, it certainly has utility in this, but do I have exactly a curve here? For individuals and for lots of things, it may be hard to evaluate. But as we will see, for industrial or commercial consumers, sometimes it does make sense and can be evaluated here. So what is the utility of Q? Well, it depends on what we do with electricity. If I'm using electricity with what is called a non-elastic load, I need Q0. I need Q0, for example, for my lights. I need lights in my house. So, and if I have only one light bulb and I need it, then the utility is essentially saying, if I don't get this amount, the utility is zero. If I get this amount, then the utility is whatever I value the fact that it works. So this U is probably very large. It means if it doesn't work, I feel a very large penalty. That's the utility function for what we call a non-elastic load. Now, an elastic load is one that can be adapted, belongs to all the categories we've seen before. For example, if this is my car, if I charge my car very fast, it's better for me. If I charge it slowly, it's less good, but it still has a value. If I need 4 hours to charge 80% of my Tesla versus half an hour, of course, 4 hours is less good than half an hour, but 4 hours is still interesting. And in some cases, that may be all that I need. So we assume here there's a utility that increases with the amount of energy we receive in a concave way, typically. Concave means the returns are diminishing. The increase in utility increases less fast than linearly when I increase things, which is very often the case for that economists use. For many utility functions, we believe things are concave. Once we've received a lot, increasing it makes us more happy, but proportionally more happy if we had received, if we receive a little, the same increment is valued more here. And then you can combine lots of things. Probably this is a more true version of what a user utility function here is. If you're below Q0, you're not happy at all. Above Q0, you need Q0 to work, and above that, you would be happy to modulate. This is what we've seen with the experiment in Norway. We see that if we ask people to reduce their energy consumption at the peak hour, they're able to reduce it. There is a decrease in utility because I have to manage my washing, and but here we can adapt flexibly once we have received some minimum here. One question is asked: what amount of energy the user will choose in the non-elastic case? Well, in all cases, we will see that users will choose, well, in this theory, it depends on the price. Here in the non-elastic load case, well, the user will choose whatever is available. If there is a constraint to have less than Q0, the user is forced to choose less than Q0, in which case the user is totally dissatisfied. His system doesn't work. If the user is offered to use more than Q, then the user has no increased benefit. So the user, in that case, would choose Q0 if there is no other constraint. But of course, there may be constraints. But that's only the demand side. There is utility, but there is also costs of provision. The supplier side, the energy is provided by generators here. And the typical model of a generator is something like this. That's the cost of a typical fuel-based generator. The cost increases linearly at the beginning because the system needs more fuel, it increases. But if we insist on generating more power, then the cost may increase more than linearly because the system might become more inefficient. So flexible supplier will typically have a curve of this type, which is convex here. And the function that is chosen is very often a quadratic function here. Of course, you may have other types of suppliers. When I say the cost, it's here is the running cost. Here we're talking of the marginal cost, how much cost you have once you have already paid the capital expenses. The idea being that the installation that I have to pay for it, whatever happens to what I produce. In particular, if you've invested in a windmill, then once it's invested, you need to pay back. You invest for 20 years, so you pay 5% every year but to recover your investment here. Now, in addition, there may be a cost for producing. If you have a simple model of a wind supplier, we could say that the cost is zero. I mean, you need maintenance, but you need maintenance whether the wheel is turning or not. So those are fixed costs. So the additional cost of generating some quantity is zero, as long up to a maximum, which is the quantity that the wind gives to you. You can reduce, you can produce less by turning the wings such that the production is less, but that doesn't bring you any benefit here, so it doesn't reduce your cost. And if somebody asks you to do more than what the windmill is able to produce, then you cannot, so your cost is infinite. So that is an inflexible cost for an inflexible producer. You may also have a flexible supplier that has a linear cost, but with a maximum capacity here. And of course, anything in between will be possible. A lot of the grids are run today with flexible suppliers that are of this shape. Of course, they have also a maximum here, but this is how a lot of the grid markets and regulation services are made. But now we find a lot more of those, and this is one of the problems we will need to solve here. Now, back to what users will do. If you're exposed to a price P that you need to pay, then you could say, what amount of quantity should I buy from the grid? Again, this is a hypothetical thing. We are probably, while working here in our offices, or in our home offices, we are not really asking which amount of energy we would like to buy. But perhaps our home energy system is asking that kind of question. So what the home energy system will do, if it sees a variable price, it will try to maximize the utility of consuming Q minus the price that it pays for that. At least that is the economical theory of how a grid consumer works. We've seen that there are other theories. In fact, what we did last week in the MPC problem, we didn't work in this way. There was not a utility function at every point in time, that the energy consumption was maximizing the utility minus cost. In contrast, we were putting a constraint that was saying, I want to minimize the cost of what I buy, subject to the constraint of running the house within bounds here. So that was a slightly, and those constraints were in the form of an MPC, which means the decision I take now at time t is not just based on an instantaneous maximization, but is based on an anticipation of what will happen in the future. But this economic theory does not consider such anticipations here. So it assumes I will choose the value of Q that maximizes my utility minus cost, which is perhaps a view of mind on the consumer side, but is the view of mind that is used by people who design regulations for demand response. On the supplier side, certainly this is closer to reality to say, now if you're a supplier, so if you have a big fuel generator, and you need to go to the market or to the regulation service to say how much you are willing to produce, you need to choose your Q, and now you're probably a company, not an individual user. So you will do your economical calculation and you'll say, if I sell Q, I will receive PQ, that's the money I will cash in, but this will cost me C of Q in particular. If this is fuel cost, then that's things that are directly comparable here. And of course, if you're rational, at least you will try to maximize to choose the value of Q that maximizes your revenue, which is PQ, minus your cost here. And then The economic theory is simply saying, well, if I compare the two, I need to look at the derivatives. The consumer will maximize that. So if this thing is smooth and has a derivative, which is not the case for all the functions we gave, but if it is smooth and has a derivative, then the value of Q would be having this thing. In particular, if U is concave, there would be a unique value that will satisfy this, where U prime is the derivative of the utility function. So the economic theory says you choose to buy a quantity Q when the price attached to this quantity is equal to the derivative of utility. And similar, you will sell a quantity Q if the derivative of the cost, so the marginal cost, is equal to the price here. So this is why markets stabilize at marginal prices here. Because if everybody does that, the price that I accept to pay, the quantity that I accept to produce when the price is P, is given by this, must satisfy this equation. So we see that it's the derivative functions that matters. So those derivative functions have a name. They are called the demand and the supply curve. So the demand curve is the derivative of the utility, and the supply curve, the derivative of the cost. So if I have an elastic load, the theory works well for elastic loads, is more embarrassing and doesn't work so well when we have curves that have discontinuities or no derivative. For this concave function here, which is the prototype of a utility function in the theory, the derivative is positive and decreasing. Decreasing because it's concave here. And similarly, the supply curve will be positive and increasing because we assume the cost is convex here. And the price here will be given at where those aggregate curves, if I aggregate all consumers and all suppliers in a given market, then both will satisfy the inequality that their derivatives are equal to the price, so they must intersect at the same point here. So the theory, the economic theory says the market finds magically a quantity Q and a price P, which is given by the intersection of those two curves here. So this is how many people reason. This is why many people reason about markets, and this is used for reasoning and designing demand response systems. Here a question: why is the cost of flexible supplier linear less than Q1? Well, so here is the reason. Here is a possible cost function for a flexible supplier. So here, I mean flexible. It's flexible because it can provide anything between 0 and Q1. And it has a maximum Q1, meaning its cost is infinity, which is an indirect way to saying there's a hard constraint. And the question is, why is it linear? Well, in general, I don't know. In many cases, it will not be linear, but in some cases, it may be linear. For example, if you have a system that is highly optimized, and in this whole range, the cost of operation, the efficiency of the engine is constant, then this is simply the fuel cost here. Or it may be an approximation of a number of small devices where you have n devices and you have a fixed cost of running each of the devices. So when you start one of the small devices, and it costs the fuel of this device here. So of course, each of those curves are simplifications. The reality is usually a mixture of everything. So take this as an assumption more than a general rule. Some generators will be of this kind, whereas approximately there is a linear cost in producing some amount of energy that is proportional to this amount. And the theory says that this is where the price will converge here. Well, let's try a few things on this theory. So first, let's try to understand what some of those curves mean. So I'm showing here 3 demand curves. Can you match them? can you do the permutation of which demand curves corresponds to which one? The first one that I'm proposing is an inflexible, non-elastic load. The second one is a flexible, means elastic load. And the third one is what we call a bid-dependent load. A bid-dependent load, bid has to do with the bid, assuming there is a market. So assuming you're running a big industry, for example, so you will consume some amount here. And you have some flexibility. You may arrange your production because, for example, you're producing aluminium. The price of electricity is a huge part of your cost, so you may adapt your production to the price here. And a bid-dependent load means that when the price reaches some level here, then we may want to reduce some amount. The price becomes too expensive for us. We want to stop consuming. By the way, David's house with the MPC that we've equipped it with last week is a kind of bid-dependent load, in the sense when the price gets high, we refuse to heat, or we try to avoid heating. I close the poll in 5 seconds. 100% on C, which is the correct answer. In particular, the inflexible load is this embarrassing function, which is exactly the problem we try to solve when we do demand response. Voilà, time for a second break.